Okay, let's talk about voter ID. These laws can feel like a giant tangled web, right? You've got different rules being talked about at the local level, the state level, even the federal level. It is a lot to keep track of. So today, we're going to untangle all those threads for you. We're going to give you a clear, straightforward breakdown of 3 key proposals that could completely change how you vote. And look, if you find all this a little confusing, you are definitely not alone. It can feel like a maze. The big question is always which rule applies where and why does it even matter? Well, that's exactly what we're here to figure out together. So let's dive right in. Here's the roadmap for today. We're going to look at 3 different proposals playing out on 3 different levels, local, state, and federal. Then we'll zoom out and explore the bigger debate around voter ID in general. And finally, we'll bring it all home and talk about what this all means for you. To really get the full picture here, you have to look at this from 3 totally different altitudes. We're going to start hyperlocal, right on the ground, and then we're going to zoom out to the state, and then the national scene. It's really the only way to see how all these proposals fit together, and more importantly, where they might crash into each other. First up, we're going to ground level in Northern California with a thing called Shasta County's Measure B. This is a perfect example of how these huge debates about election rules can start really, really small at the local level, driven by citizens themselves. So what in the world is Measure B? Well, it's a proposal started by citizens to amend the county charter. And you can think of a charter as kind of like a mini constitution just for that county. So if this thing passes, its rules are only meant to apply right there, inside the borders of Shasta County. And the changes it's proposing? Whoa, they are sweeping. Measure B calls for a photo ID at the polls, sure, but it goes way beyond that. It also wants to limit mail-in ballots, require that every single ballot is counted by hand by volunteers, and even unplug the local voter lists from the state system. I mean, these are massive departures from how things are done now. But here's the real bottom line, the crucial point. Even if voters in Shasta County approve Measure B, it would almost certainly be blocked by the courts. And why is that? Well, it comes down to a legal idea called preemption. Basically, California courts have said over and over that the core rules of elections are a statewide concern. That means a single county can't just make up its own rules that contradict state law. And since Measure B clashes with state laws on, well, pretty much everything, voter ID, mail-in voting, ballot counting, it would almost certainly be ruled unenforceable. Okay, so let's pull back from that one county and zoom out to look at the entire state of California. This next proposal, it's not just a local rule change. It's a full-on attempt to change the state's highest law, its constitution. So unlike Measure B, which is stuck at the county line and has to obey state law, this proposed constitutional amendment would apply to every single voter in all 58 counties. And because it would actually change the Constitution itself, it would have the power to override all those existing state laws we were just talking about. It's a whole different ballgame. This proposal has a few major parts. It would require a government-issued photo ID to vote in person, and you need the last 4 digits of that ID for your mail-in ballot. But, and this is a big but, to deal with concerns about access, it also mandates that the state provide free voter ID cards for anyone who needs one. Another big focus is requiring the state to use government records to verify that voters are citizens. So if this amendment were to pass, it would fundamentally reset the rules for the entire state. It would create one single uniform standard for voter ID in California. That would force the legislature and every single county election office to update their systems, retrain all their poll workers, and start the process of issuing those free IDs. A huge shift. All right, time for our final zoom out, all the way to the national level. There's a bill called the SAVE Act that has passed the U.S. House, and its goal is to create a federal standard, but just for federal elections. Let's see how this adds a third and potentially overruling layer to everything. The SAVE Act is a proposed federal law, and here's the absolute key distinction you have to remember. It only applies to federal elections, so we're talking about races for president, the U.S. Senate, and the House of Representatives. It wouldn't directly change the rules for state or local races, like for your governor or mayor. The requirements here are very specific and pretty strict. To even register to vote in a federal election, you'd need to provide documentary proof that you're a U.S. citizen. We're talking a birth certificate or a passport. Then you'd also need a photo ID to actually cast your vote. And finally, states would be required to use the Department of Homeland Security's SAVE database to verify citizenship. So you might be thinking, how does this affect a state like California that doesn't require ID right now? Well, it all comes down to something in the U.S. Constitution called the Supremacy Clause. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. Federal law trumps state law. If the SAVE Act becomes law, it would immediately override California's rules for federal elections, forcing the state to follow these new standards. And that could create this really complex two-tiered system for ballots that have both federal and state candidates on them. So here's how they all stack up, side by side. You can see they operate in completely different worlds. You've got Measure B, which is local, but it's pretty weak because it's limited by state law. Then there's the statewide amendment, which is powerful within California because it would change the Constitution. And finally, the SAVE Act, which is federal, overrides state law, but only for those federal races. Each one has a different scope, a different level of legal authority, and its own unique set of rules. So we've got a handle on what these proposals are, but why? Why are they being debated so intensely? Well, it really all boils down to this fundamental tug of war that has been at the very heart of election policy for decades, the balance between election security on one side and voter access on the other. On one side, supporters of these measures argue they're essential to prevent fraud and, maybe just as importantly, to boost public confidence in election results. They see a clear, uniform ID standard as just common sense. On the other side, opponents worry that these rules could become barriers, making it harder for elderly, low-income, or minority voters to vote if they have trouble getting the required documents. They also point to studies showing that the kind of fraud these laws prevent, in-person impersonation, is incredibly rare, and argue the costs and hassles just aren't worth it. Okay, with all this stuff happening at the local, state, and federal levels, I know, it's easy to feel a little overwhelmed. But the most important thing you can do is just stay informed and be prepared. So let's talk about a few concrete things you can actually do. So what's your to-do list? First, pretty simple. Check your ballot to see if any of these measures are on it. Second, take a minute right now to make sure your own ID is current and you know where it is. Third, if you can, help others by sharing information, especially about free ID options if they become available. Fourth, and this is a big one, get your information from official sources like your Secretary of State. And finally, the most powerful thing you can do, participate, vote, and make your voice heard. You know, in the end, all of these rules and all these heated debates, they really circle back to one single powerful idea. As one of our sources put it so well, voting is not just a right, it's a responsibility that we all share. And that brings us right back to the central question that's driving this entire issue. What is the right balance between making our elections secure and making sure everyone has access to vote? It's a really complex question, there are no easy answers, and it's something for all of us to think about. Thanks so much for tuning in.